I am excited to be here with you today. I am reading from the book White Rage. I will share it here. Hopefully, I figure out how to get this flipped by the time I post this. But this book is called White Rage. It's by Carol Anderson, and subtitle is The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. I read this book a while ago, and it's a heavy book. It's a heavy book, and I set it down, and I've come back to it because as we're doing more of this work, as people are getting more involved in their decolonizing work and their anti-racism work, it's important to read books like these. It's important to understand what that rage or what that intensity of feelings and entitlement looks like from a place of whiteness. I think it's important to recognize that if we are going to center white feelings or whiteness when we're talking about decolonizing and anti-racism, it's important to understand where those feelings come from, where they originate from. So we're going to be doing this chapter by chapter, starting off with chapter 1, which is titled Reconstructing Reconstruction. James Madison called it America's original sin, chattel slavery. Its horrors, Thomas prophesied, would bring down a wrath of biblical proportions. Indeed, Jefferson wrote, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. In 1861, the day of reckoning came. The Southern states' determination to establish their independent slave republic led to 4 years of war, 1.5 million casualties, including at least 620,000 deaths, and 20% of Southern white males wiped off the face of the earth. In his second inaugural address in 1865, Abraham Lincoln agonized that the carriage of this war was God's punishment for all of the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil. Over time, the road to atonement revealed itself. In addition to civil war, there would be the Emancipation Proclamation, 3 separate constitutional amendments, one that abolished slavery, another that defined citizenship, and the other that protected the right to vote. And finally, the Freedoms Bureau, with its mandate to provide land and education. Redemption for this country's sin, therefore, would not require just the end of slavery, but also recognition of full citizenship for African Americans, the right to vote, an economic basis to ensure freedom, and high-quality schools to break the generational chains of enforced ignorance and subjugation. America was at the crossroads between its slaveholding past and the possibility of a truly inclusive, vibrant democracy. The 4 Year War played out on the battlefield after battlefield on an unimaginable scale had left the United States reeling. Beyond the enormous loss of life to contend with, more than 1 million disabled ex-soldiers were adrift, not to mention the widows seeking support from a rickety and virtually non-existent veterans pension system. The mangled sinews of commerce only added to the despair, with railroad tracks being torn apart, fields fallow, hardened and barren, and bridges that had once defied the physics of uncrossable rivers now destroyed. And then this. Millions of Black people who had been treated as no more than mere property were now demanding their full rights of citizenship. To face these challenges and make this nation anew required a special brand of political leadership. Could the slaughter of more than 600,000 men, the reduction of cities to smoldering bubble, and casualties totaling nearly 5% of the United States population provoke America's come to Jesus moment? Could white Americans override the continuing repugnance, even dread, of living among Black people as equals, as citizens, and not property? In the process of rebuilding after the Civil War, would political leaders have the clarity, humanity, and resolve to move the United States away from the racialized policies that had brought the nation to the edge of apocalypse? Initially, it appeared so. Even before the war ended in late 1863 and early 1864, Representative James M. Ashley, a Republican from Ohio, and Senator John Henderson, a Democrat from Missouri, introduced in Congress a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery. The 13th Amendment was in important ways revolutionary. Immediately, it moved responsibility for enforcement and protection of civil rights from the states to the federal government and sent a strong, powerful signal that citizens were first and foremost U.S. citizens. The 13th Amendment was also a corrective and an antidote for a Constitution whose slave-owning drafters, like Thomas Jefferson, were overwhelmingly concerned with states' rights. Finally, the amendment sought to give real meaning to "we hold these truths to be self-evident" by banning not just government-sponsored, but also private agreements that expose Blacks to extra-legal violence and widespread discrimination in housing, education, and employment. As then Congressman James A. Garfield remarked, the 13th Amendment was designed to do significantly more than confer the bare privilege of not being changed. That momentum toward real freedom and democracy, however, soon enough hit a wall, one that would be more than any statesman was equipped to overcome. Indeed, for all the saintedness of his legacy as a great emancipator, Lincoln himself had neither the clarity, the humanity, nor the resolve necessary to fix what was so fundamentally broken. Nor did his successor. And as Reconstruction wore on, the U.S. Supreme Court also stepped in to halt the progress that so many had hoped and worked for. Lincoln had shown his hand early in the war, heavily influenced by two of his intellectual heroes, Thomas Jefferson, who advocated expulsion of Blacks from the United States in order to save the nation, and Kentuckian Henry Clay, who had established the American Colonization Society, which had moved thousands of free Blacks into what is now Liberia. Lincoln soon laid out his own resettlement plans. He had selected Chiriquí, a resource-poor area in what is now Panama, to be the new home for millions of African Americans. I want to stop there for a minute. Instead of acknowledging that Black people were Americans and deserved to stay in this country, he wanted to find a place to exile them to. Lincoln just had to convince them to leave. In August 1862, he lectured 5 Black leaders whom he had summoned to the White House that it was their duty, given what their people had done to the United States, to accept the exodus to South America, telling them, "But for your race among us, there could not be war." As to just how and why your race came to be among us, Lincoln conveniently ignored. Meaning he ignored the fact that the Black race became part of them, the white race, because of the kidnapping and subsequent slavery and enslavement of Black people. Okay. His framing of the issue not only absolved plantation owners and their political allies of responsibility for launching this war, but it also signaled the power of racism over patriotism. Lincoln's anger in 1862 was directed at Blacks who fully supported the Union and did not want to leave the United States of America. Many indeed would exclaim that despite slavery and enforced poverty, we will work, pray, live, and if need be, die for the Union. Nevertheless, he cast them as the enemy for wickedly dividing us, instead of dividing as traitors those who had fired on Fort Sumter and worked feverishly to get the British and French to join in the attack to destroy the United States. From this perspective flowed Lincoln's lack of clarity about the purpose and cause of the war. While the president and then his successor, Andrew Johnson, insisted that the past 4 years had been all about preserving the Union, the Confederacy operated under no such illusions. Confederate States of America, the CSA Vice President Alexander H. Stephens remarked, "What did we go to war for but to protect our property?" This was a war about slavery, about a region's determination to keep millions of Black people in bondage from generation to generation. Mississippi's Articles of Secession stated unequivocally, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. In fact, 2/3 of the wealthiest Americans at the time lived in the slave-holding South. 81% of South Carolina's wealth was directly tied to owning human beings. It is no wonder then that South Carolina was willing to do whatever it took, including firing the first shot in the bloodiest war in U.S. history, to be free from Washington, which had stopped the spread of slavery to the West, refused to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, and with the admission of new free soil states to the Union prior to 1861, set up the numerical domination of the South in Congress. When the Confederacy declared that the first duty of the Southern states was self-preservation, what it meant was the preservation of slavery. To cast the war as something else, as Lincoln did, to shroud the hard, cold reality under the cloak of preserving the Union, would not and could not address the root causes of the war and the toll that centuries of slavery had wrought. And that failure of clarity led to a failure of humanity. Frederick Douglass later charged that in the hurry and confusion of the hour and the eagerness to have the Union restored, there was more care for the sublime superstructure of the Republic than for the solid foundation upon which it alone could be upheld, the full rights of the formerly enslaved people. Millions of enslaved people and their ancestors had built the enormous wealth of the United States. I want to read that again. Millions of enslaved people and their ancestors had built the enormous wealth of the United States. Indeed, in 1860, 80% of the nation's gross national product was tied to slavery. Yet in return for nearly 250 years of toil, African Americans had received nothing but rape, whippings, murder, the dismemberment of families, and forced subjugation, illiteracy, and abject poverty. The quest to break the chains was clear. As Black residents in Tennessee explained in January 1865, we claim freedom as our natural right and ask that in harmony and cooperation with the nation at large, you should cut up by the roots the system of slavery, which is not only a wrong to us, but the source of all the evil which at present afflicts the state. For slavery, corrupt itself, corrupted nearly all, also around it, so that it has influenced nearly all the slave states to rebel against the federal government in order to set up a government of pirates under which slavery might be perpetrated. The drive to be free meant that 179,000 soldiers, 10% of the Union Army, and an additional 19,000 in the Navy were African Americans. Humanity, therefore, cried out to honor the sacrifice and heroism of tens of thousands of Black men who had gallantly fought the nation's enemy. That military service had to carry with it, they believed, meaning the Black people, the Black men, citizenship rights, and the dignity that comes from no longer being defined as property or legally inferior. To be truly reborn this way, the United States would have had to overcome not just a Southern, but also a national disdain for African Americans. In New York City, for example, during the 1863 draft riots, Black men and Black women were attacked, but the rioters singled out the men for special violence. On the waterfront, they hanged William Jones and then burned his body. White dock workers also beat and nearly drowned Charles Jackson, and they beat Jeremiah Robinson to death and threw his body in the river. Rioters also made a sport of mutilating the Black men's bodies, sometimes sexually. A group of white men and boys mortally attacked Black sailor William Williams, jumping on his chest, plunging a knife into him, smashing his body with stones, while a crowd of men, women, and children watched. None intervened. And when the mob was done with Williams, they cheered, pledging vengeance on every nigger in New York. We know what happened recently in Montgomery, Alabama, and we saw what happened, and we saw that people did not stand idly by. And there's been a lot of thoughts and opinions about how violence isn't the answer, and et cetera, et cetera. When you hear this, when you hear that violently brutalizing Black men was done for sport, while people stood and watched and cheered on, what happened in Montgomery is nothing in comparison. What happened in Montgomery was a group of people coming to make sure that no further harm was caused to another human being. They're not the same thing. This violence was simply the most overt, virulent expression of a stream of anti-Black sentiment that conscribed the lives of both the free and the enslaved. Every state admitted to the Union since 1819, starting with Maine, embedded in their constitutions discrimination against Blacks, especially the denial of the right to vote. In addition, only Massachusetts did not exclude African Americans from juries, and many states, from California to Ohio, prohibited Blacks from testifying in court against someone who was white. The glint of promise that had come as the war ended required an absolute resolve to do what it would take to recognize 4 million newly emancipated people, as citizens. A key element was ensuring that the rebels would not and could not assume power in the newly reconstructed United States of America. Yet, as the Confederacy's defeat loomed near, Lincoln had already signaled he would go easy on the rebel leaders. His plan for rebuilding the nation required only that the secessionist states adopt the 13th Amendment and have 10% of eligible voters, white propertied males, swear loyal to the United States. That was it. Under Lincoln's plan, 90% of the power in a state could still openly dream of full-blown insurrection and consider themselves anything but loyal to the United States of America. As one South Carolinian explained in 1865, the Yankees had left him, and I quote, one inestimable privilege, and that was to hate him. I get up at 4:30 in the morning, he said, and sit up till 12 midnight to hate him. The Liberator reported that in South Carolina there were very many who did not disguise the undiminished hatred of the Union. The visceral contempt, however, extended far beyond the Yankees to encompass the formerly enslaved. One official stationed in the now defeated South noted, "Wherever I go, the street, the shop, the house, or the steamboat, I hear people talk in such a way as to indicate that they are yet unable to conceive of the Negro as possessing any rights at all." He further explained how murder, rape, and robbery in this Kafkaesque world were not seen as crimes at all, so long as whites were the perpetrators and Blacks the victims. Given this poisonous atmosphere, he warned, the people boast that when they get freedom affairs in their own hands, to use their own classic expression, the niggers will catch hell. To stop this descent into the cauldrons of racial hate, African Americans had to have access to the ballot box. The reasoning was simple. As long as Blacks were disenfranchised, white politicians could continue to ignore, or even worse, trample on African Americans and suffer absolutely no electoral consequences for doing so. The moment that Blacks had the vote, however, elected officials risked being ousted for spewing anti-Black rhetoric and promoting racially discriminatory policies. But in 1865, that was not to be. Suffrage was a glaring, fatal omission in the president's vision for Reconstruction, although one that was consistent with the position Lincoln had taken early in his political career when he insisted that he did not favor Negroes voting or, for that matter, I quote, Negroes serving on juries or holding public office or intermarrying with whites. That's Abraham Lincoln. I am not, Lincoln has said, nor have ever been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social or political equality of the white and Black races. That's a good reason to stop touting Abraham Lincoln as some sort of savior when it comes to enslaved people. It was never for Black people. The situation only worsened with the presidency of the man who stepped in after Lincoln's assassination. To be sure, during the war, Andrew Johnson, a Tennessee Democrat, had blasted the Confederate leadership and plantation owners as traitors who must be punished and impoverished. But his resentment was rooted in the class envy of an embittered man who had grown up achingly poor, hardscrabble, and illiterate, utterly unlike the Southern gentry who had challenged the Union. Johnson's antipathy, however, did not translate into support for Black equality or the abolitionists, whom he disdained. Indeed, the contempt this sometime slave owner felt for Black people was palpable. I'm going to stop again for a second. So we're talking about Andrew Johnson here, and the way that he grew up was impoverished and illiterate, very similar to how Black people grew up or were raised or lived in that time. He had that in common with them. And this is something that we can relate to today. There's a commonality of a group that's different than you, but a commonality, and ultimately the goal is still the same. But because of white supremacy, because of whiteness believing that they are better than, he instead continued the fight against Black people who very easily could have been an excellent ally. But that mindset, white is right, got in the way. Indeed, the contempt for this sometime slave owner felt for Black people was palpable. Addressing a regiment of African American soldiers who had just returned from a tour of duty in October 1865, the president lectured them. I quote, "Freedom is not simply the principle to live in idleness," he chided the men. "Liberty does not mean merely to resort to the low saloons and other places of disreputable character. Never mind that these were men in uniform, men who had honorably served the United States. In this president's estimation, Blacks, despite years of service to the nation and a willingness to put their lives on the line, 40,000 had died during the war, were just immoral, drunken sluggards. How then could the epic violence that had consumed the United States have been about the nation recognizing the very humanity and citizenship of these beings? The new president, just like Lincoln, had convinced himself that and said that the Civil War was only about preserving the Union, no more, no less. And therefore, he set about stitching the rebel South back into the fabric of the nation. The Confederate flag, this is the history of the Confederate flag. The denial of acknowledging the humanity of Black people. We're going to stop there. We're about halfway through the first chapter. And this should probably give you an idea as to why this book is one that you want to come back to, and you don't want to give it too much time between it. But in chapter 1, we are already seeing about how this country is ran on the hatred of Black people more than it is on the hope for a democracy or the hope for this being the greatest country in the world. From the very beginning, it has been about making sure that Black people know that they are considered less than, making sure that Black people know that they're considered nothing more than property, all for the preservation of the country that was built because of the kidnapping of the very people whose humanity they wanted to deny. Thanks for going through this with me. I am going to be back with you next week to continue chapter 1 and discuss more. And I would love to hear your thoughts about this. I would love for you to also, my action item, because I give an action item, I want you to, if you're not reading this book, journal what you felt in hearing this half of the chapter. Think about where you felt this in your body. Think about what it made you feel, how it made you feel. This is one of the situations where history isn't necessarily repeating itself. We're just still in our history. It has just changed its form. Thanks for staying with me today. Thanks for reading with me today. And I will be back soon.